What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Biggest early round running back busts. In this video, I'll be going over some early round running backs that have the clearest path to busting. Now, you guys know some of the early round running backs I don't love this season. I don't like the potential volume decrease and pretty clear touchdown regression of Aaron Jones, and I don't love the potential decrease in receptions along with the extreme inefficiency of Fournette. But I've talked about these guys a lot, so I want to bring up some names that I don't go over as much and see if we can identify some other players with bust potential. Also, remember that these guys are going early for a reason. They have a ton of upside, and they're generally considered the safest running backs to draft. I don't want you to think that I'm saying you need to avoid every single player on this list, because as of recording this, my only two early round running back avoids are Fournette and Aaron Jones. I just want to bring up some other running backs that do have a few concerns so that you realize not every early round running back pick is just a slam dunk. Some of them are, for sure, but not all of them, especially when you consider what it takes to get them. So I hope that makes sense. Before we start the breakdown, of course, we need to do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat: which wide receiver led all rookies in third down targets last season? The answer was Hunter Renfrow. Bet a lot of you did not see that one coming, and the winner was Dollar Bill. Today's stat: which running back had the highest drop rate in 2019? Also remember that our draft package is now live. You can get it directly or by getting all in on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. If you get all in, remember that we are giving away another signed jersey this month, courtesy of Pristine Auction. So make sure you guys show them some love. And if you want a free $5 credit to use on whatever sports memorabilia you want, then just use the promo code FFA when signing up for your Pristine Auction account. So let's look at some potential running back busts. And the main things we're looking for are players who meet at least some of the following conditions. Are they coming off a very lucky season for touchdowns? Do they have a lot of competition for touches? And that's either on the ground or through the air. Do they have a concerning injury history? Not talking about players who missed a few games that one time with a minor ankle injury, but players who have a history that could impact them going forward. Are they on a bad offense? By no means can you not produce high-end production on a bad team. It just means that the chance of a running back busting are a little bit higher if there aren't that many yards and touchdowns to go around on the offense. And lastly, what does it take to get them? Fantasy football is all about value. Drafting the running back 13 in the 5th round is pretty good. I'll take that. But drafting the running back 13 first overall would be a disappointment. So we need to consider where each player is being drafted right now. Oh, and by right now, I mean in FFPC drafts, current ADP for redraft leagues. All the major sites are pretty terrible right now, probably will be through mid-August. So using paid leagues is kind of the best that we can do. So that's what I'm using for ADPs. So using this logic and not including Aaron Jones or Fournette, the first player we're going to go over is Derrick Henry. And I know a lot of you are probably pretty confused by this, but hear me out. Henry scored 16 rushing touchdowns on an expected 9.8 given his opportunity, which makes him the second leading regression candidate behind Aaron Jones. And had he scored his expected 9.8, then he would have finished as the running back 7. So if we play this season out a million times, he's closer to the running back 7 on average. And that includes keeping his 75-yard receiving touchdown in week 1, which was 34% of his total receiving fantasy production across the entire season. You heard that right. One target in week 1 last season was 34% of his receiving fantasy points. They don't use him in the receiving game, and they just replaced Dion Lewis with Darren Evans, who they plan on using not only as a third down back, but also as an option to ease the workload of Henry in an effort to keep him healthy. So we have a player who needs to rush for over 1,500 yards just to return value on an offense that's extremely likely to regress. Tennessee was 8th in points per game last season, despite ranking 30th in plays per game. That might be able to repeat if you have Russell Wilson at quarterback, but no matter what you think about Tannehill, he's not an elite quarterback. So they're not going to finish 5th in yards per play and points per play again. And given how game script dependent we know Henry is, that's dangerous. So I'm not going to spend a first round pick, a mid first round pick, on a player like that, especially when we consider how up and down his production can be. So I get the allure, and we were all over him in the mid third round last season, but I see bust potential taking him in the mid first because there are way too many things that need to go right for him to return value at that spot. The next player is just a little bit later in the first round, and that's Nick Chubb. The potential issue with Chubb is not the touchdowns like with Henry. He actually scored 2 fewer than he should have on average. But it's what he needs to do on the ground to return late first round value. Chubb was 11th in points per game last season, despite 1,500 rushing yards, and that's counting half a season without Hunt. Because once Hunt showed up in week 10, Chubb dropped to 18 carries and 2.1 targets per game, which is good volume, don't get me wrong, but it was only 19.4 touches per game. And if you look at the other running backs going after him, Kenyon Drake goes a half a round later, 18.9 touches per game as a Cardinal. Miles Sanders goes a round later, 19.8 touches per game after taking over. Jacobs goes a round later, 20.1 touches per game. Fournette goes nearly 2 rounds later, 22.7 touches per game. Bell goes over 2 rounds later, 20.7 touches per game. David Montgomery, 3 rounds later, 17.3 touches per game from week 2 on. So 19.4 is good, but it's not earth-shattering. And if Chubb is getting most of his touches on the ground, then he's going to need a ton of rushing yards to pay off a first-round ADP. Because he only averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game after Hunt returned, which is low-end running back 2 production, even being on pace for nearly 1,400 rushing yards during that time. So I get it if you think this offense is going to improve and maybe he has a ceiling season for touchdowns, but he needs to get lucky in the touchdown department to pay off this ADP because what he did with Hunt in the lineup last season isn't going to cut it. He'd need closer to 1,700 rushing yards. That would put him on pace to return value, and while that number is doable, it's an aggressive projection, and he absolutely has a path to busting at his ADP if he's going to remain less involved in the offense with Hunt there. Chris Carson, third guy will go over, late third round ADP, and Carson has been unbelievably lucky with his injuries in recent years. Fantasy owners might not realize it, but he remains one of the highest injury risks at the running back position. He's yet to play a full season since his junior year in high school, and as a pro, he's missed time with a leg fracture, hip sprains, and ultimately his hip fracture to end last season. Then prior to being drafted, he also broke his thumb, fractured his forearm, and tore his ACL. And while we do expect him to be healthy in week 1 following his season-ending hip injury, we can't be sure. And given that Seattle hasn't exactly been the most truthful with injury information, it's certainly possible that Carson isn't as far along in his recovery as they say. Now, I ultimately do think he'll be out there in week 1. I want to be clear on that, but we can't be sure. And this was a major injury that we need to add to a long injury history for Carson. So there's a concern that he takes a small step back in effectiveness. And given that they have Hyde and Dallas and likely Penny about halfway through the season, there's at least a chance that we don't see the workload we're used to seeing for him. And we don't see him being as effective as we're used to. So I just think people need to be more aware of the risk with Carson because the narrative would be completely different if he had suffered the hip fracture earlier in the season instead of week 16, because then he would have missed the majority of 2 seasons in his first 3 years, even suffering the exact same injuries. And people would be comparing him to Geis, but they're not, because the injury happened in week 16, not week 5. The final running back we'll go over today is Raheem Mostert, early 5th round ADP, and I just don't understand that. Like, how can you feel good about Mostert that early? He's 28 years old, has less than 200 career touches, and even when he was going off late last season, all his value came from touchdowns. I mean, he scored 12 touchdowns in his final 9 games, yet had over 12 carries in just 3 of those 9 weeks, while averaging 1.7 targets per game. And if you look at the 3 playoff games, he only had 3 targets and 8 total receiving yards across those 3 games, and even with a 220-yard rushing game, right? That just monster performance. He only had 55% of the 49ers rushing yards in the playoffs. So how can you feel good about taking him in the early 5th round when the wide receivers going after him in that round and beyond are Lockett, Woods, Keenan Allen, Metcalf, Parker, McLaurin, Hilton, Chark, Diggs? I don't see how you could like a roster construction that passes on these wide receivers so that you can take a running back with no receiving upside, facing more touchdown regression than any player in the NFL. I mean, this kid scored a rushing touchdown on 1 out of every 10 carries from week 12 on, which is when they started using him. Derrick Henry was tied with Aaron Jones for the league lead, 16 rushing touchdowns, yet Mostert scored at a rate twice as high as Derrick Henry. And on his 8 regular season rushing touchdowns last season, he only had an expected 4.4. Had he scored 4.4 like he should have, he would have dropped to 12 points per game of that stretch, which is low-end running back 2 territory. And that's on an offense that's extremely likely to regress, because remember how good their defense was last season. That's unlikely to continue in 2020, at least not to that same level, because we know defenses are not that sticky year over year. That's going to lead to more pass-heavy game scripts, and that's bad news for Mostert. So I just don't see it. There's no reason you should be drafting him over the wide receivers in that range, because you should already have solid running backs by the 5th round. And this is why we target running backs early, because if you don't, then you're forced to take Mostert over the great wide receiver options, and that's not something you should be doing. So, those are some potential early round running back busts for the 2020 fantasy football season. Remember to check out our website for my take on every draftable player, along with rankings, sleepers, busts, and a whole lot more. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button, and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.